Welcome to Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach Commentary. I'm Gary Francione. This is, I am losing count, I think it's the 14th No Frills, No Bells, No Whistles podcast concerning the abolition of animal exploitation, the failure of animal welfare reform, the importance of veganism as a moral baseline, and the notion of ahimsa or nonviolence as a motivating and directing force in all of our advocacy efforts. This week, I have with me Roger Yates, who is a sociologist. Dr. Yates teaches at University College in Dublin and at the University of Wales in Bangor. And Vincent Guihan, who is a almost doctor. He's a PhD student at Carleton University, where he's in the cultural mediations program. And I have to tell you, I would have had Vincent on the podcast before, but I'm now going to confess a prejudice as to why he hasn't been on before. I thought Vincent was doing his doctorate in comp lit, in comparative literature. And I don't recognize that as a legitimate discipline, so I wasn't going to. I wasn't going to have. I'm only kidding. For those of you who have comp lit degrees, I'm just joking.
It's almost as bad as sociology.
Well, no, not quite. No, at least
religious studies.
No, actually, the worst thing is, I'm doing my degree in the virtues of postmodernism. Then I think you should not only not be on my podcast, but I think you should be exiled someplace bad. But he has now explained to me he's in the cultural mediations program, where what he's doing, what his particular project is looking at Canadian novels and the concept of non-animal personhood in those novels, and to see how the concept of animal personhood is developing, changing, and what it says about the human non-human animal relationship in literature. And I think that's really, really fascinating. Are you at the stage yet where you're doing your dissertation?
Yes, I am.
Ah, well, that's good. I hope to. I look forward to reading it. So I hope you'll send it to me whenever it's available for people to read. What we're going to talk about this week is whether the tide is turning, and whether or not things are changing and moving in the direction of abolition and veganism as a moral baseline. From the past several podcasts that I had, in which Roger Yates was also a guest, along with Elizabeth Collins, we talked about the two segments of One Planet, Animals and Us that was broadcast on the BBC World Service, which is the most widely listened to radio program on the planet. The program was done by Victor Schoenfeld, who did the 1982 film, the Animals film. And I have to say something, everyone always talks about animal liberation as being, the influential thing that of the modern animal movement. Well, putting aside the fact that Animal Liberation is not a book about animal rights at all, I don't doubt that Animal Liberation had a great influence in a lot of ways. But I also think the Animals film had a tremendous influence on a lot of people, and in that it was the first time that people saw how animals were used. And unlike a lot of what we see now, where these organizations put out videos showing various abuses of animals in institutionalized settings. There's no such thing as a non-abusive use of animals in these institutionalized settings, but where they're depicting what's supposed to be sort of the system gone wrong. And what was really good about the Animals film is it was a film about how animals are treated in vivisection and in farming within the system when the system's functioning properly. And it was bad given that. And that's one of the, and I think that was a really important point that the Animals film made, was that even when the system's working properly, it fails. It's shocking. It's horrible. And I would go so far as to say that the Animals film certainly was, I think for many people, as influential as Animal Liberation in terms of forming ideas that led us to reconceptualize the human-non-human relationship. And Roger, you were around back then. Would you agree? I mean, with my assessment of the importance of the animals film.
Yes, I certainly do. I was based in Britain at the time, and it was a big impact there. The grassroots in particular took it on, really, and it's a cinema release. If you get the DVD of the animals film, there's a really good interview, actually, with Victor Schoenfeld as part of the DVD package. Very much logical too, in actual fact. And he even explains the way that it was produced and the reason why all the cartoons and the vox pops and everything were put in there. And of course, it was a cinema release. I mean, it's 2.5 hours long. I mean, it's incredible kind of length in a sense, and yet it's not boring, and also it's not too full on, if you like. In fact, that's what he explains in the DVD, that he didn't want just to kind of create a horror film with people kind of running out after 5 minutes, which is, the way the style. In actual fact, it's interesting really, if you think about people like Michael Moore, the style of the animals film. If young advocates, because I know a lot of animal advocates of this day and age, they've all watched Earthling. The very few have watched the animals film. And if they did, I think they'd see the style and they think, oh well, this is pretty normal. But it was the kind of first time that kind of thing was done. At least it was kind of fairly groundbreaking at the time. And so the grassroots took it on, and what tended to happen there is that we had special showings all around the country, and then what Schoenfeld allowed to happen was that the grassroots people were able to present them, so they were able to give a speech afterwards or before, and then I think it was responsible for a lot of people joining the grassroots movement as well as the national groups.
Absolutely. Well, anyway, so Victor did this 2-part segment on BBC World Service, Animals and Us, and the second segment dealt with vivisection, but he ended it with a call for crystal clarity in principles. He recognized that the movement was failing and that it wasn't making much progress, and he recognized or acknowledged the need for really clear principles to move us forward. And what he focused on was the notion of veganism as a moral baseline. And he included some of the interview that he did with me, in which I talk about the importance of veganism as a moral baseline. And I was really quite surprised, because I had no idea that was coming when I was listening to the segment. I had not been told before. I was listening to it just like everyone else was for the first time, and I was really surprised that Victor included that, and I was delighted, obviously. And then Victor did an editorial in the Guardian, which is one of the leading newspapers in the United Kingdom and represents a more progressive view. And what he's in this editorial, which is called the 5 I'm just pulling it up here, the 5 fatal flaws of animal activism. He talks about how he was a vegetarian for a long time, for much of his life, and that that was a very important thing to him. And he talked about why he didn't become a vegan and whatnot. And then he says, he talks about how now in the 21st century, it's time for vegans to become vocal. Even free-range eggs and organic milk production entail significant suffering, and the animals are killed when their productivity goes down. And so, again, in The Guardian, he talks about, he uses again the notion of veganism as the moral baseline, and he identifies 5 flaws in the animal rights movement. The 5 flaws are: the animal rights movement is not joining with other progressive social movements. The second flaw, which is related to the first flaw, indeed, not only does it not join with other progressive social movements and tries to go it alone, but it actually engages in sexist campaigning, which alienates progressive people. That the animal rights movement hands out awards and praises animal exploiters, gives awards to slaughterhouse designers. I don't know whether you all know, but Home Box Office is going to have a movie, a dramatic film, starring Claire Danes in the role of Temple Grandin. It's coming out in February, and I understand that they're going to then be following up, and they're going to be doing a musical comedy on the life of Hermann Goering, who designed the death camps in the Second World War. But in any event, but that they give out awards to people like Grandin, and that they praise fast food restaurants, and that the fourth problem is that they're actually promoting animal products with things like the RSPCA Freedom Food label, the Whole Food Compassionate Animal Compassionate label, the Certified Humane Raised and Handled label that is supported by a lot of the groups in the United States, including the Humane Society, and the fifth problem that is that basically the animal movement lacks a strategy, and that it's really time now to change that. And the way he proposes we change that is to start becoming vocal about veganism. And this was followed 3 days later in The Guardian by Ingrid Newkirk, who did an essay called A Pragmatic Fight for Animal Rights, in which she defends, she makes two major points. She defends animal welfare reform, and she basically says PETA pursues welfare reform. PETA is a welfarist organization, but we're really trying to move it in the direction of abolition. This is what I called New Welfarism in my book Reign Without Thunder in 1996. This idea that we're going to get to some good point by incrementally through welfare reform. She repeats that. And then she goes on to say she defends the sexism as being, it's just harmless antics, and it puts a smile on people's face, and what difference does it make? And I saw this, and that's what I want to talk with you two about today. I think what Schoenfeld has done is remarkable. He's a guy, he makes the Animals film in 1982. He then goes off and does other things. He comes back 27 years later. He's a disinterested party. He takes a look at the movement and says it's not going anywhere. And he quickly, clearly identifies the problems with new welfarism, the problems with using sexism to promote animal rights. And he concludes none of this is working, and we really ought to pursue veganism as a moral baseline. And then Newkirk jumps in and says, no, we ought to be pursuing welfare reform, and it's quite all right for us to be using sexism. It's all harmless. And I thought this was interesting because it indicates to me that the large groups are starting to understand now that the tide is changing, the tide is turning, that there is a grassroots movement, and it's developing all over the world. And that it's basically cynical about these large groups, recognizing that they're businesses, recognizing that they are in bed with institutional producers, recognizing that they're promoting animal products, recognizing that they're really going about this the wrong way, and that they're basically part of the problem, not part of the solution, and that we really do need to sort of reorient ourselves toward, really a dynamic veganism, veganism and creative, nonviolent vegan education. I thought this was really remarkable, and I don't know if that's just my optimism, but I'm doing a reality check. So, guys, tell me, is it just my optimism, or is there something going on here?
Well, I think Schoenfeld's program and his piece in The Guardian do two important things. I agree with you. I think first, they make it absolutely clear that the public is ready to hear about veganism. And second, it exposes the vulnerability of an organization like PETA to criticism. I worked as a freelance journalist for a little while earlier in my career, and I can say that the BBC wouldn't be airing Schoenfeld's program, The Guardian wouldn't have run Schoenfeld's piece, they wouldn't be allowing Ingrid Newkirk to reply and so on, unless these ideas were ready for the public. I'd say the same thing is true about Gary Steiner's piece in the New York Times.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely, and around Thanksgiving. In fact, I would say it's more than just the public being ready, but being interested in these things. The Happy Meat movement is a good example. That's a wide public phenomenon because people are interested in solving what amounts to a fairly important ethical dilemma in their lives, and industry has told them, and the welfare part of the industry has told them, you can solve it with Happy Meat. But more important, major publications with massive audiences just aren't going to publish this kind of stuff if they feel there's no audience for it, or if they felt it's going to alienate their audiences. But yes, I'd say this reflects a very serious change that's been ongoing for a while. And second, PETA has responded in this instance, I'd say, because Schoenfeld's piece is forced him to do so. I don't think there can be any doubt that Schoenfeld's piece seriously spooked PETA into a response. Large organizations, not just PETA, but most groups in the U.S. have worked diligently from a public relations standpoint to ensure that theirs are the only voices, theirs are the only messages that are heard by the public. They try to create an intellectual vacuum. They rely on agreements. They coerce silence. And they've done a tremendous job silencing the advocacy community by convincing advocates that there is no alternative but to repeat the official party lines of national organizations and their figureheads. Schoenfeld, in contrast, is someone who's not affiliated with anyone, who, as you said, he is disinterested in the various political eddies of the advocacy movement. He's really only interested in what's right for non-human animals, and he's looked at the situation, said, forget these antics, drop this sexism, let's start speaking honestly, sincerely, and directly about veganism as a baseline if we want to help non-human animals. And I couldn't agree more. That's someone looking from the outside in, and saying welfare groups are doing it wrong. Although his piece in The Guardian deals with PETA largely, I think his criticism applies to HSUS, Vegan Outreach, Eric Marcus, all of those businesses and figureheads who are not promoting veganism as a baseline. Schoenfeld was basically telling them, you're doing it wrong. And that's a powerful statement to make. I think it reflects a real change, and I think he was absolutely right.
Well, he actually had HSUS in the first segment of the BBC program Animals and Us. He interviewed Wayne Pacelle, who, in my judgment, didn't come off looking terribly good in terms of defending welfare reform. And so and even though he seemed to think that the Austrian situation was a little bit different, but in both the BBC program and particularly in the Guardian piece, he was very clear that he thought that although the Austrian situation may be a little bit different, the bottom line is it's also a failure. It's just like slightly less of a failure, rather than characterizing it as a partial success. I think what he was saying is it wasn't quite as bad a failure as some of these other situations.
Yeah, that's how I think about it as well. I agree largely with Vincent's analysis, obviously. I think what's going on here is that the PETA piece in The Guardian is very defensive, but they felt they must respond because of the person who was attacking them, essentially. What we've had is someone who got involved with the issue of animal treatment and animal use in the 1970s, made the Animals film in the 1980s, went away for a while, came back and said, right, let's take a look at the movement that I played some part in inspiring, and you can tell really from the programs and also from the piece that he wasn't very impressed about what he found when he came back. And what was striking to me was that, as you say, Gary, he points to Austria as the best we've got. But that's not very much in the end as well, which is quite interesting. But the other side of that is that he doesn't point to PETA, who are characterized as the biggest and the most influential animal rights group in the entire world. They don't even get a mention, so that's quite a damning thing that his assessment 27 years later from the Animals film doesn't even mention them. And so, Ingrid Newkirk is going to have to respond to that, and it's very, very defensive, as we see.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting, something really hit me when I read Ingrid's piece, and that is she references Peter Singer, and she says, Peter Singer supports
practical philosopher.
Yeah, she calls him the practical philosopher. But Peter Singer supports their position because he's basically saying, isn't it better if we make the animals suffer less, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, obviously, Newkirk does not and never has address the problem that animal welfare reform, because animals are property, animal welfare reform is generally accepted only when it provides some sort of economic benefit for us, and that model that I first described in Animals, Property, and the Law holds for basically not all, but most animal welfare reforms fit that model perfectly, in that they make the exploitation of animals more efficient. And she doesn't deal with that at all. Of course, none of them does. I mean, none of them does because they can't. But what I thought was interesting was it really occurred to me how close Newkirk and Singer really are in their basic, their fundamental ideology. The animal welfare movement was founded in the 19th century by people who believed that although animal suffering mattered, animal use didn't, and that we could use animals because they didn't have an interest in their lives, they just had an interest in not suffering. As long as we didn't make them suffer too much, our using them was not a problem. And that's really Singer's position. I mean, Singer's position is really no different from Bentham's position. Singer does not think that most animals, with the he exempts the non-human great apes and perhaps dolphins, but he basically says that most of the animals we eat, and he particularly has this prejudice about chickens. He thinks they don't really have an interest in their lives. They don't have they're not self-aware. They don't have an interest in their lives. So therefore, killing them is not imposing a harm on them. And he says this. I mean, he says this in a number of places. This is not any sort of secret. And it's very, very clear that PETA has the same view, because that explains why they don't have a problem with killing healthy animals. I mean, they according to Newsweek magazine, they kill 85% of the animals that they rescue, quote, rescue, end quote. And as I discussed in my book Rain Without Thunder, in the 1990s, they were killing animals. They had a no-kill shelter called Aspen Hill, and they were killing healthy animals there. So this has been going on for a long time, and I suspect that there is some agreement with Singer's position that a quote humane end quote death is really not a harm for an animal, because unlike us, they don't have a sense of the future, so they don't really care whether we kill and use them. They only care about how we treat them. Now that, of course, is wrong, and I explain that in several of the things that I've written. I mean, even if I went to someone's house while they were sleeping and I killed them painlessly while they were sleeping, I would still be imposing a harm on them. And the notion that we don't impose a harm on animals when we kill them is crazy. The idea that animals don't have any interest in living strikes me as such an odd position to take, a particularly odd position to take for someone who's called the father of the animal rights movement, and a particularly odd position for someone like Newkirk to take. The idea that taking the life of an animal is not something that presents a problem, is as long as it's done humanely, is just so very bizarre to me. But I really think actually that is that's what's going on here, and that's why I think these folks have. I think that's one of the reasons why these folks embrace welfare reform. They don't understand the economic problem. They really don't. They don't understand economics 101, and they don't understand that welfare reform is always going to be limited because of the chattel status, because of the status of animals as economic commodities. It's always going to be limited, and it's always going to provide very little protection for animals, and they just don't recognize that. But I suspect that's really what's going on here, is they think that animal welfare reform really can make some significant progress, and if it does, that's great, because it really doesn't matter that we keep on eating them, because as long as we don't make them suffer too much, as long as we raise them in a relatively pleasant environment, and as long as we kill them in a relatively painless way, we're really not doing anything wrong. And that I think is the position. That's certainly the position that Singer articulates, and I think it's
well,
the
yeah,
position.
and also, Gary, I mean, you were talking about how influential animal liberation was as a text, and still is. In fact, sociological studies of that have shown that when you do a survey about that, most animal advocates have either got animal liberation or read it, but very few have read any other philosophical work. And I think it's quite telling also that Peter Singer is the only philosopher mentioned in Ingrid Newkirk's piece. I do think that they're the only philosopher that Peter could have because of their view of non-humans. But the interesting thing, I guess, is that what ought to be pointed out, if you like, in defense of Singer, is that he's been consistent all the way through. Even in Animal Liberation, he was saying that he can't really come up with a moral argument against free-range eggs. You know, so he is consistent. You remember a couple of years ago when he got into trouble when he was debating the vivisection called Tippy as is. And obviously, he says also in the book, you know, not all experiments are going to be ruled out either. And so he's just been putting forward, expounding a consistent view right from the 70s. It's just that animal advocates have not latched onto that and have been quite happy to regard him as the father of the animal rights movement. And that's the situation right now. It's a situation that I think that, in all honesty, Peter should address. I've asked them myself to stop calling Animal Liberation an animal rights book. I actually got a petition about that because if you go to the US site, you can see a flag which says "Why Animal Rights." You click on that, and it goes to Animal Liberation. It concerns me greatly on the grounds that I feel that people, students, college students, school kids doing their animal rights project are going to go to Peter. It's a well-known brand, and they're going to then be directed to Singer, and so that means that the message of animal rights is distorted.
Well, yeah, and you're right to say Singer has been consistent about it. The problem is Singer is very, very happy to sort of continue to be called the father of the animal rights movement. Singer is very happy to, I find that a little bit disturbing that he sort of continues to sort of bask. I mean, he uses it on his own promotional materials. I mean, he continues to use that expression, which he says, well, it's a shorthand expression, but nevertheless, he knows it's causing a lot of confusion. But you're right; he's been consistent, and it is remarkable the number of times you know there's no animal advocate I've ever met that doesn't have Animal Liberation, but I don't know very many who have read it. Because whenever I say it's not a book about animal rights, or it's a book in which he distinguishes between killing and suffering, and basically says that suffering's a problem, but killing it may not be a problem, or he can't come up with an argument against free-range eggs, or whatever, that he says those things in the book. They say, "Are you kidding? You're joking." Not in my edition. And I say, well, you obviously haven't read it because it's not an animal rights book. It's not a book which requires the abolition of animal exploitation. Indeed, it's a book which promotes animal exploitation of a certain sort. That basically what he's calling for is he wants animals to have a reasonably pleasant life, a relatively painless death. That's what he wants. Indeed, as a utilitarian, it seems he's almost committed to saying that we ought to be bringing into existence as many animals as we possibly can, and giving them, as long as they have pleasant lives, we ought to be bringing into existence as many as we can, and killing them as painlessly as we can, and bringing more and more and more and more and more into existence, because that's what a utilitarian would want to have happen. But in any event, Vincent, what thoughts do you have about this whole business with PETA and Singer and all of these groups and whatnot? Because I know you have a very finely tuned sense as to the dynamics of the movement.
Well, I think just go back to something that Roger mentioned, which I think is true. I think that PETA, there's a lot of rational incentive for Singer to not rebut too much of his praise from PETA, and I think that there's a rational incentive for PETA to point to Singer, because I think that Singer is a thinker who justifies what amounts to their business decisions. Your work, Tom Regan's work, I don't think it justifies PETA's decision to kill tens of thousands of animals since '98, and that, referring back to the Newsweek article that you mentioned, I don't believe these groups are interested in or motivated by philosophy so much as business and marketing myself. I'm a materialist. I look at these things from an economic standpoint. And I think it provides them with a veneer of philosophical acceptability. But what I think these organizations are really interested in doing is creating a series of lifestyle badges that allow people to feel that they made a difference by making a donation or dressing up in a chicken suit or handing out, a couple of Go-Veg pamphlets. They're not really all that interested in what's best for non-human animals, or they've conflated so deeply themselves, their own movement, with what's best for animals that they can no longer tell the difference. I'm honestly not sure which, but I think it is largely an economic phenomenon. Anyhow, that's my take on it.
I mean, it's interesting how it's also interesting how when PETA first started, it was very, very different from the Humane Society of the United States. I mean, HSUS was a very different organization from PETA, and I remember those days quite well because it was during the 1980s, before I started really thinking critically about the rights welfare distinction. We used to. It was a relatively small community, and we used to get together a lot, and so it would not be uncommon for PETA people to be socializing with people from HSUS or from the Animal Welfare Institute or whatever, and there were real differences in these organizations, and PETA being really different from all of them. And now it's seems to me that there's not a lot of difference between PETA and HSUS.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that speaks to a broader, an ongoing trend in the welfare industry, and it's been going on for years. I don't think it's particularly new. I think it's just sort of coming to a head now. Which is that the industry is large enough and that there's enough competition for donors and volunteers and money that it's quickly shaping up into three basic factions. And that's a sphere of influence led by HSUS, and that includes groups and figureheads like PETA, Vegan Outreach, Eric Marcus, COK, and they're all sort of, it's interesting, there's a sort of a coalescence around the Human Research Council because there's a member from Vegan Outreach on the board, there's a member from HSUS on the board, and it's all very new welfarists. There's a real love-in.
But by the way, before you continue, this is great. I want to interject. I thought it was fascinating that you had Vegan Outreach. Vegan Outreach came out against Victor Schoenfeld's call for veganism. I mean, isn't that just remarkable?
Oh, well,
Well, sadly not, unfortunately, isn't it?
But go ahead. I'm sorry, Vince. I'm sorry.
It's an extremely sad thing. But the second faction are what I would say are new welfare groups, and some of them are militant, some of them are non-militant, some of them are actually traditional welfare groups. But what they don't want to do is come under HSUS's sphere of influence for whatever reasons. It might be economic, it might be ideological, it's really hard to say. And of course, I think abolitionists make up a third faction. And it goes without saying, I think that there are a lot of advocates who see themselves as being in the middle. I'll break out my 25-cent vocabulary word at this point and use the word hegemony.
Yay!
Because as a Gramsciist, hegemony is one of my favorite words. And a lot of people misuse...
What was that word, Vincent?
Hegemony.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, I didn't catch it.
He's trying to get you to repeat it.
Well, repeat what, Gary?
Hegemony. A lot of people misuse the term hegemony, but in Gramsci's terms, it just means that a group is working towards building and leading a coalition of other groups with shared interests. And people sometimes use it as a synonym for authoritarianism, sometimes as a sort of a very lay synonym for fascism, and that's not really what Gramsci meant. But
for the folks out there who don't know who Gramsci is, why don't you explain briefly who?
Well, Gramsci was an important Italian communist, and his work has become actually much more important in cultural studies since after the war. But he was put into prison. He wrote a bunch of prison notebooks. He was put in prison by Mussolini for being a communist.
Some of those people have been in prison, you know.
Well, I think you have to go to prison to write a really great book in some cases, but not necessarily all. But anyhow, so Gramsci is a communist, and he's very influential in cultural studies today. But he comes up with this notion of cultural hegemony, and what he suggests is that change happens when a group becomes sufficiently powerful enough in order to order social relations. So what they do is they organize other groups, other social groups, and Schoenfeld sort of indirectly talks a bit about this when he talks about animal rights, making relationships with other social groups. But what hegemonic groups do is they create these coalitions and they come to power and they change social relations. So, for example, George Bush got to tell religious, social, and fiscal conservatives what to do for about 8 years, even though he also had to make compromises in order to get their backing. And then, of course, they all told everyone else in the United States how to run their lives for 8 years. And that's sort of how hegemony works. There are meaningful moral and political battles for cultural hegemony. For example, Gramsci's own fight against the Italian fascists. But the battle in the welfare industry is not meaningfully different, I would say, from, say, Sony and Nintendo's battle for hegemony in the video games market, or Coke and Pepsi's battle for hegemony in the soda market. It's really one business set against another set of businesses.
Yeah, they all become auctions. I mean, I think obviously the companies are often used nowadays. Could I just ask you a question, Gary? I remember you saying on a podcast or an interview about in the early days of PETA, you were sat around a kitchen table with Ingrid and Alex, and maybe there was only 2 or 3 people there. I just wonder whether in those days, you know, when you saw this group develop, it went from a very kind of radical group, you know, with some very kind of radical ideas and some radical slogans. And did you then get the impression that people were starting to say things like, well, you know, I think we're going to need an office, you know, and what about a press officer, and maybe we need this and that and the other, and, you know, what about full colour leaflets rather than these black and white ones? Did you get the impression that things moved into a kind of business-like position over the years? And one of the things, perhaps, that made you rather disillusioned with it?
Well, I think in the beginning, when they had no resources, I thought that they were tremendously effective, and it was a relatively small group of committed individuals. I mean, see, during the 1980s, the focus was on these exposés. You know, it was on the business that had gone on in Taub's lab when, you know, Alex Pacheco got a job in a lab that was doing work with macaques, and he got some video footage and showed that in fact this was really horrible and it was being done improperly, etc. And there was that expose. And then there was the University of Pennsylvania head injury experiments. There was that expose. And then there was the baboons kept in a place in Maryland called SEMA that were being used for some sort of testing. I forgot what it was actually, but there, you know, these were exposés. These were largely, you know, PETA was focusing on vivisection and on exposés of vivisection, and that was the primary focus. As a result of those campaigns, particularly the Taub campaign and the University of Pennsylvania head injury campaign, PETA started getting a lot of attention. And I don't know that it was really any sort of deliberate decision that was made to become a business. As a matter of fact, I think well into the 90s, PETA was still trying to remain faithful to some sort of different sort of approach to these issues, because I remember Newkirk being very upset with Henry Spira, who was now dead, but Henry Spira was an advocate who was promoting the idea of working with the cosmetics industries, and he was getting contributions from the cosmetics industry so that he could start an so that he could finance alternatives to the Dre's test and those sorts of things, the LD50 and those sorts of tests. And I remember Newkirk being very upset with him.
Yeah, he was working with Revlon and people like that.
Yeah, and she was very, very, very angry about that, and she thought that was a very bad idea, and she was very critical of Henry for that. And I remember, discussions that were going on in PETA fairly late about how really we shouldn't be supporting welfare reform, and then all of a sudden things changed, By the time that had happened, by the time they had really sort of become completely commercial, I was out of it because I had problems with the sexism issues, which started in the late 1980s. I had very serious issues with the sexism thing, and then with the killing of healthy animals at Aspen Hill, I had super serious problems. And so by the time the mid-90s came around, when PETA really started shifting and becoming a welfarist organization, I was no longer really part of it, and I mean, I saw that it was getting bigger, and I was I occasionally would visit, but I wasn't really as involved as I was in the early days. So but it very clearly, I mean, it very clearly it's seductive. Because, people are throwing a lot of money at you, and you want to keep that money coming, and you start realizing that if you take certain positions, if you promote veganism as a moral baseline, and you make it clear that that's what what we have to work for, we have to work toward. You can join the organization without being a vegan, but we want to be clear that there is nothing short of veganism which is morally acceptable, and we aren't going to promote anything short of veganism as morally acceptable. Then that's going to decrease your donor base.
Yeah, well, that's why. In fact, Vincent did a podcast about this weird concept which I really hate, and I think Vincent does as well. This notion of vegan, or because I remember in the podcast, Vincent would say, "I'm not even how are we supposed to even pronounce this thing, But the reason I asked you the question, Gary, is that there is some interesting sociology about all of that, in the sense that there is this theory called resource mobilization theory, which kind of tries to explain social movements in terms of becoming a business or becoming an organization. And there's some criticism of the theory itself at the moment, but there is a kind of core to it, I think, which is quite interesting in the light of PETA. But just to give some background about the sociology of social movements, when sociology started to look at social movements, they were very critical of them. There was this idea that society itself has built-in mechanisms by which it would bring a problem back to equilibrium, and so therefore a social movement shouldn't really be necessary. And so if people were forming the social movements and then protesting, then the theory kind of suggested that there was something wrong with them. Then we got into the 1960s, and we had Vietnam and the civil rights movement and all the rest of it, and the second wave of feminism. And a lot of social movement theorists, and especially their students, found themselves on demonstrations, and their theory was telling them that there was something pathological about going on a demonstration. There's something wrong with you, and they suddenly thought, well, wait a minute, perhaps there's a problem with the theory. And so what emerged from the rethinking, in Europe there was something called new social movement theory, but in the States in particular there was a thing called resource mobilization theory. And that does kind of tend to explain some of the things that you've just said, because what tends to happen is a small group of people with radical ideas, they start off in a kind of very grassroots way, and then they start to think, well, do we need an office, or do we need to have an official constitution for this group, and do we need to grow? And then they start to get support, and then they start to have things like AGMs and EGMs and this kind of thing, and it becomes much more of a kind of business, to the extent that some of the analysis suggests that one of the main functions of these groups in the end is the perpetuation of the group. And what tends to happen then is that the radicalism that started it gets moderated and moderated away. And I think we can really see that with PETA. You might remember that in the paper that we're working on, Gary, there is some work that I've cited by Richard Gale. And Gale, even in the 1980s, is already updating resource mobilization theory, because he says that it fails to adequately address the role of the state. And in fact, he talks about state agencies, really. So we're talking about, agricultural agencies who have got a kind of a relationship with the state. And I've done some work on social movements and the counter movements as a kind of dyad, if you like. But really, what this theory is suggesting is that there's a triad at work, which is social movements, counter movements to the social movement, and then the state or the state agency. So it's quite an interesting kind of thing. But also what Gale says is that resource mobilization theory, in its crude sense, doesn't also account for movement change. But it did in some respects, in the sense that it expected movements to get bigger, but when they get bigger, they get flabbier. And also, when they get bigger, they start to moderate. And so we get a conflict between fundamentals and pragmatics. And it's interesting, given the title of Ingrid Newkirk's piece in The Guardian, talking about pragmatics and how practical the philosopher Peter Singer is. But the problem there is that the pragmatics are the things that are driving the moderation. And so, I can really kind of see how this theory is kind of explaining a lot of what's gone on in Peter, from the radical start when you were involved to this kind of flabby corporation position that it's in right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I remember in the mid-1980s, I started promoting this idea that we really ought to, be putting our resources, and I was not talking just about PETA. I was talking, I was trying to convince everybody I could that everybody ought to join forces, sort of, and promote veganism. That was going to shift the paradigm. That only when we shifted the paradigm away from the notion of eating animals as the default position, or eating animal products as the default position, would things really change in any significant way. And in retrospect, people didn't like that idea, and I think in retrospect it wasn't so much ideological as a recognition that if they do that, it's going to really mean a very small donor base, and it's going to mean that we're going to stay small for a while, for a long while we're trying to educate people about veganism, and we're not going to be able to grow. So I think in a sense it may not have been a conscious business decision, but there was probably thoughts of how do we make the how do we get these organizations bigger. Certainly one of the interesting things that happened fairly early on was PETA had chapters. They were trying to encourage grassroots. They were trying to encourage the development when they first started. They were trying to encourage the development of a grassroots movement, and so they had chapters all over the place, and then they shut them down. They just shut them down, and everything became centralized. And activism shifted gradually from doing the work yourself and really being an activist and an advocate yourself to writing a check to PETA. And and now really that's what the new welfarist movement has done. It's turned everybody.
Yeah, well, there's a direct parallel there with the experience of the BOV. They had kind of grassroots campaigners, and I knew two or three of them whose job was to go around the country helping local groups set up. That was the big thing in the early 80s, a direct kind of parallel with what was going on with Peter in the early days as well. But I think you're right that they become very conscious of their donor base. And was it Dan Matthews? Who mentioned that they were suddenly very aware of who was giving them the money, and so that fits perfect with the fact that they would choose to return, if you like, to the philosophy of Peter Singer, because that is the only philosophy that could live with it, really.
Yeah, I think it's now very clear that the movement is a business, and it's a business that functions. The mainstream movement is a business, and it's got this sort of weird cultish aspect to it that you can't question anything. Any questioning is divisive, and you're hurting the animals if you question things or if you don't support welfarist reforms, you're hurting the animals, and it's all this culty nonsense. But it really is a business, and it's a big business. I mean, it's a really big business. I mean, we're talking about organizations that are multi-million-dollar organizations, and there are very few of them. I mean, there are very few of the large organizations, that I mean, they've all got tons of money, and I find it really offensive when you have like the Haitian disaster, and you have all these organizations now with pictures of their people and their safari. Apparently, whenever you sort of are outside of the United States doing work, you have to sort of wear safari clothing or whatever, but they're in Haiti doing this work, and you got little donate buttons and stuff like that. I mean, it really is obscene, because these are organizations that some of them have hundreds of millions of dollars, and and they're not doing stuff that they could be doing for animals in the United States. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, with the amount of money that the movement has, there shouldn't be a single animal in a single animal shelter anywhere. There shouldn't be 300,000 animals on Pet Finder. I mean, I just think that's wrong. But so they're not doing things for animals that they could be doing in the United States, but they're in Haiti, and they're doing fundraising off. I mean, it's a very, very effective, powerful, big money-making machine, and it functions, with the notion that people come home, they're tired, it's a bad economy. A lot of people are working, 2 jobs, and they're still not making it. They're looking at all sorts of problems. They get home, they open their mail, and there's this horrible picture of this animal. There's a horrible picture, and they feel that they've got to do something. And so even though they don't have a lot, they donate the money. They donate their money to these organizations. And so it really is. It's insidious in a lot of ways. It really is insidious. But I mean, I think things are going to change. I think things are in the process of changing now, and I think that as the younger generation of animal advocates are now being exposed. You see, they weren't exposed to any alternative thinking before the internet, and before we were able to sort of start these communities in cyberspace. They weren't exposed. I mean, people who were interested in these ideas, if depending on their orientation, whether they were, were they primarily people who were interested in dogs and cats, whatever, and they would go off to HSUS, or were they people who sort of wanted to get into the sort of more supposedly radical end of things? They would go to PETA, and then there were other corporations that that they could choose from that were minor variations from PETA or HSUS, but that was it. That's how people got involved. Young people got involved. New people got involved by joining an organization, and then they got indoctrinated with the garbage from these. They got indoctrinated with the propaganda from the organizations, and that's what happened. Now I think the younger people and the newer people who are getting into this are seeing that there's a debate. And they may not all agree with the abolitionist approach, and that's fine. But they at least see that there's a debate, and I think a lot of them now are seeing through the what is in essence the business of animal welfare, and they recognize that it's not getting anywhere, and they see through it, and I think those are the people who are part of the abolitionist community. These are the people who are doing their own advocacy work. These are the people who don't accept the notion that writing a check is how we're going to make this all better. And they are the people who realize that this is a piece of a much larger problem, the problem of violence. And I think that we're seeing a greater recognition amongst a lot of these younger people that the animal rights movement is really sort of part of a larger enterprise, that it really is. It's part of the peace movement, and it's part of the movement against violence. And I think that a greater number of people are seeing that connection, and as part of that, they're rejecting the things like the sexism of PETA and whatnot, which I want to talk about. What do you? I mean, what sorts of discussions are you seeing about the sexism issue?
Well, the standard line, of course, in defense of PETA is usually that women make choices, and I think that there's a certain amount of validity to that. On the other hand, I think that a system that values choices for all individuals also has to hold each of those individuals responsible for their choices. And more importantly, I think it neglects sort of larger social structural questions about patriarchy and male supremacy and so on and so forth. I mean, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, there are a lot of people who just want to silence any criticism of PETA. So they will grasp at any straw and say, oh, well, we shouldn't criticize PETA. Yes, they're, drawing attention to the issue. They're raising awareness. That's what organizations have to do. And there's no critical thinking about that. There's no questioning about whether or not PETA's style of raising awareness is actually raising awareness, or what awareness is it raising? Is it properly educating people, or is it improperly educating them? Is it miseducating them? And I think that, the sexism is absolutely terrible. It's completely objectionable. It's an embarrassment. You often reference MLK in your work, but I can't possibly imagine, even some of the contemporary academics and activists like Bell Hooks or Mike Dyson or Cornel West, stripping down and trying to get their message out that way. That would be totally ridiculous. And on top of that, they wouldn't be trying to silence the discussion so that only their voices were the ones that were heard. We fight racism and we fight sexism, we fight heterosexism and ableism and all these other rational prejudices with discussion, with meaningful outreach, with trying to build communities that actually talk about these issues. And it's the exact opposite in the animal advocacy movement. They want to silence any criticism as quickly as possible so that their marketing messages can get out. And I think the sexism issue is a good example. Anyone who disagrees that PETA's campaigns are sexist is often labeled as, histrionic or...
itself a sexist word.
and it's deeply troubling, I think, for anyone who takes sexism and feminism very seriously.
Yeah, I think, this business that women choose to do it is just such nonsense. I mean, yeah, they choose to do it, but they're making those choices within a patriarchal culture. And it's sort of like saying, well, slaves could choose to have sex with their owners. Well, yeah, they could, but they were slaves, and the choices that they were making and the decisions that they were making were occurring within the context of slavery. Now, I recognize that the situation of a woman in our present culture is not the same as that of a slave in race-based slavery, but I would still say that given the gender roles and given the phallocentric culture that we have, the choices that these people are making are choices that are occurring within a patriarchal situation. And sort of say, well, just because women are making those choices, that's a good thing, is so silly. I mean, but that is one of the. But
we've also got to think critically about the idea of choice. I mean, the notion of choice comes up in sociology in the same way as the notion of free will in philosophy. But the thing is, one of the quintessential truths sociologically is that there is no choice, no free choice in a sense, because we are free and unfree at the same time. Nothing that we do is not mediated by society and society's
Sure.
views and norms and values,
Absolutely.
And, you mentioned, well, slavery is over. Well, slavery is not over in many places. And so what worries me about these sexist campaigns is if a liberated woman, in inverted commas, in the West or the Third World or the developed world, all these phrases that we could use, if they choose to go naked rather than wear fur and, in a sense, kind of choose to commodify themselves, well, that's possibly going to have a very kind of deleterious effect on less powerful women in the third world or the developing world, or places where trafficking is still prevalent. Where if they're helping create a demand for that kind of service, if you like, in sex trafficking, this kind of thing. And so, as Vincent said, with rights, as it were, comes responsibilities, or with freedoms or choice comes comes some responsibility, and so we have to think. And I suppose in the patriarchal world, that does put some onus on women, in particular, probably a little bit more than men in one sense, in the sense that a woman in one part of the world exercising choice can have a big impact on the way that women in other parts of the world are viewed, because it's been viewed within that patriarchal culture. And that seems to be the major structural fact that viewpoint about, well, this is just women deciding, misses completely.
Yeah, I mean, the thing. Let me correct one thing. If I gave the impression before that I thought slavery was over with, race-based slavery in the United States is now illegal. I mean, obviously slavery exists in other parts of the world, and racism is still rampant in the United States. So I don't want you to think that I maintain that slavery is over with or that there is no slavery. Slavery exists, and the thing is that nobody defends slavery anymore. When it's found, when it's discovered, people are critical of it. Nobody tries to say, well, this could be justified or whatever. I mean, people are fairly uniform, not completely, but fairly uniformly critical of chattel slavery. But I would also say, Roger, that it's not just a question of like what decisions that are made here, what effect they have on women in other parts of the world. I think that decisions that are made here have effects on women here, and in that they reinforce, to the extent that women play into these patriarchal institutions. Can they empower themselves by using sexuality? The answer is sure they can. But but they empower themselves by participating in the institutions which have oppressed them and which give them the option of empowering themselves only through methods and means that constitute their and perpetuate their oppression. So there's something.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I mean, it's crazy, and I think the State of the Union undress this year. I mean, they've done this for the past 2 or 3 years, where they have a woman doing a full strip and with the frontal nudity bit, and then they intersperse this with the cuts of Congress, and they try to and they have this woman telling you about all the wonderful things Pete has done so that you'll give them money. This year they have a woman of color doing it, and the thing, it's just so offensive on so many levels that it makes me wonder. I mean, it's almost like if you asked me, what would be, if you really wanted to screw things up in the animal rights movement, if you really wanted to harm the cause of animal rights, what would you do? And I'd say, well, one thing I might do is have women do strips. I mean, some of these things that PETA does are things that you would think would be done by an agent provocateur to
well, if you saw it in a film, you probably wouldn't believe it, would you?
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, some of the stuff that they do is stuff that is just so crazy. But I wanted to ask you a question as a sociologist, and it goes back to something Vincent said before about can we really say that the mainstream movement is a movement when, I mean, as much as sociological theory might say that organizations tend to, as time goes on, they get bloated, they become more ineffective, they become, whatever. They still retain some notion of ideology, don't they? Or, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm asking. Because it just seems to me that the animal movement, the mainstream animal movement, is just so much a business where there is no, Vincent pointed this out before, that there is no discussion. You might have, people like Cornel West or Bell Hooks or folks like that, whatever differences there exist in terms of their views on civil rights issues or racism issues, there's discussion that goes on. Nobody's trying to shut down the discussion. No one's trying to use coercive tactics to shut down the discussion. Whereas if you asked me for the defining characteristic of the modern animal movement, the mainstream animal movement, I would say it's to shut down discussion. There is no discussion.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I guess I think there's various answers to that one. I guess if you were to talk to people who are involved in the environmental movement, and certainly people who've been involved with feminist movements and social organizations over time, they'll probably say there's quite a lot of that kind of power relations going on there, which ultimately shut down discourse. What tends to happen, I think, with social movements is that that's one of the driving forces of all the kind of splits that tend to occur. But also, I think going back to this theory that I mentioned, what tends to happen is the business angle of it tends to become into the foreground so much that the other things go into the background, and then there's a kind of search then to, well, what do we do which will then service the business needs, because we've now got a bunch of careerists with good jobs in jobs for lives. We've got a multinational business effectively going on here now, and so then there's a search for, well, what do we do? And of course, one of the products that they produce to maintain this business is victories. That's their product. And then say, well, okay, where do we get our victories from? And rather than thinking that every new ethical vegan can be presented as a victory, they want something else than that, and they then turn to welfare, and they then tend to exaggerate every small thing that they can present as a victory, and they blow it out of all proportion, like they have with the controlled atmosphere killing type thing. I think that's what tends to happen, is that the theory says that ideology is still there, dispute goes on. Obviously, in terms of power relations, the powerful try and silence the ones with less power, and as we know, until the internet, you were effectively silenced, Gary. We know that it can't be done anymore. And another interesting thing I think about the internet is that the very kind of reason for having a large business type organization, that's also gone now. And I think you were talking about the consciousness of the younger generation. I think that they are questioning more and more, why do we need a massive organization like the Peters and the HSUS? Because we can do it through the internet. Vincent does that with the pamphlets and the virtual billboard. And people can make their own films now. They can make their own videos. They can get that out. It's very cheap. People can make their own pamphlets. They can make their own leaflets. I think there's still a little bit of a clinging on to the past in some senses. I get the impression that the kind of age, the era of the Peters and the HSUS are coming to a kind of natural conclusion in a sense, because they're just not needed now. The internet have made them redundant. What keeps them going is the fact that there's a momentum, because it's such a massive thing. And I think what tends to happen in terms of the analysis of Peter from maybe a grassroots position or an animal advocacy position is that people are starting to make a couple of columns, if you like. People are saying, well, what don't I like about Peter, and what do I like about Peter? Well, the people that I know would have put in the positive column, their pamphlets, their leaflets, and their videos and their website. That looks great, doesn't it? And in the negative side, they would then put things like the sexist stuff and the KKK demonstrations. All the kind of things are embarrassing. A lot of people are saying more and more that Peter embarrassed them, because it provides such easy opportunities for people opposed to animal rights to attack them. So Peter is an embarrassment to some degree, but the positive side always mitigated against that. And I think what's happening there is the positive side is diminishing, and the problem side of Peter is growing, as people see, well, actually, I can do that. I don't need Peter for the videos anymore, because we can do that together. 2 or 3 people could produce videos, put it on YouTube, burn them to DVDs, send them around the world. These massive corporations are no longer needed, and in some senses, Victor Schoenfeld also realized that with his analysis of the modern day movement. So he's seeing that the model that is Peter and the big organizations are not needed. The internet is there. The discussion now is there. The different theories are around, and it seems to me that we are looking at change, and these big dinosaurs are dying out.
Yeah. What do you? Any thoughts, Vincent?
Well, no, I agree with Roger. I mean, I think that increasingly the internet is really allowing activists to network together. I think that's very positive. I think the change in computer technology makes it even easier for people to do their own pamphlets, to do their own video material, to do their own podcasts, and that really is changing the game. So I agree very strongly with Roger. I think that these groups are an aging paradigm. I think that they won't be with us forever. I think that I also believe that more and more advocates are just finding their own voices. I think that social movements, they tend to be a little bit staggered, and feminism is a good example with different waves, although notions of waves of feminism are a little bit problematic. I mean, the truth is that history progresses in certain ways, and I think that's also true of animal advocacy.
Yeah, no, I think I very, very strongly agree with both of you on that. I mean, and it's not just PETA; it's all of these large organizations. I think this is one of the reasons why they are so desperately clinging to these things like Proposition 2 in California, or the Controlled Atmosphere Killing Campaign. These are all nonsense. I mean, they're not. I mean, to call these things nonsense is to insult things which are truly nonsensical. But I think that they cling to them because they realize that these are some of the things that people can't do necessarily by themselves or in small groups. They need a larger organization. They need legal staff. They need they need lobbyists. They need this. They need that. So they have to sort of keep promoting these welfare reforms that need organizational support. They have to keep promoting those things because those are the things that advocates can't do. And as soon as people start challenging whether those things are worthwhile to pursue, now you're really attacking the main thing, the bread and soy margarine that these folks rely on, because once advocates start seeing that Proposition 2, which is it is boggling to me that anybody thinks that Proposition 2 is a good idea, or that people got behind that idea. It's remarkable. But what these large organizations are doing is they're looking for the low-hanging fruit. They're looking for the economically inefficient practices, and they're going after them. And they're doing it in a way so that it appears as though these things can't be challenged except through a large organization. So you've got to keep, donating to us. When in fact most of these things are going to change anyway because they're economically efficient. Roger and I are busy working on something now, talking about how if you take an abolitionist approach, if you advocate abolition, if you advocate animal rights, if you do that sort of claims making, you're going to end up with welfare reforms anyway. So you don't really need the advocacy of welfare reform, and you don't need these large animal organizations with these large legal staffs and these large lobbying staffs pursuing these welfare reforms, because if all you did was advocate, if all you did was advocate for animal rights and abolition, institutional users would respond by making these welfarist changes anyway. But in any event, I think the takeaway we get from all of this is that things are changing. The tide is turning, and we aren't going to be dominated by these large organizations for much longer. It's already changing now. People are following their own voices. They're reading other things. They're listening to other perspectives. They're making their decisions. They're deciding what arguments appeal to them and what arguments don't appeal to them. And I think that what we saw this week, I think the Schoenfeld thing actually. It's gonna take a few years to tell, but I think Schoenfeld not only made the Animals film, which I think is itself a historical matter, a matter of historical importance, but I think we're going to look back on Schoenfeld's BBC documentary, The Animals and Us, and this Guardian article and Newkirk's response. I think we're going to see that as yet another significant point in the animal movement because it, for the reasons we talked about today.
Yeah, well, I think that very strongly, and precisely because of not only who Victor Schonfeld is, but precisely because he went away and came back again. I think that's very important in a sense, that he comes back with a fresh eye, and he looks at what there is now. He's obviously not very impressed, and in fact, I got the impression he was maybe a little bit angry about what he saw. I think he sees waste, and he sees misdirection, and I think you're right that people are going to look back at this thing. We're going to owe a debt of gratitude to Victor Schonfeld, I think.
Yes. Absolutely. Well, look, I want to thank you both very much. I know I apologize to the listeners. We went on a little long, but obviously you can, sort of decide when you want to sort of listen to it, so you can turn it off and then listen to it some more. I thought it was extremely engaging, and I hope you listen to it all in one chunk. In any event, thank you both, Dr. Roger Yates, who is a sociologist, teaches at University College in Dublin and the University of Wales and Bangor, and Vincent Guihan, who is a doctoral student at Carleton University. And I really appreciate your insights. If you are not vegan, people, you've got no excuse. Come on. It's incredibly, incredibly, incredibly easy. It's better for your health. It's better for the planet. It's the morally right thing to do. Check in at www.abolitionistapproach.com. If you go to our links page, you can also find links to Roger's site, which is called On Human Non-Human Relations. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yes, and Vincent's site, which is Animal Emancipation. I have that right, don't I?
Yeah.
Yes, and you can get links to their sites, or follow us on Twitter. But anyway, thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back with another No Frills, No Bells, No Whistles podcast soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.